coming up.
The Prime Minister said, like I said yesterday, that interest rates would come down. He was sure of that. And the National Bank said Canadian households should not expect any significant relief from housing cost inflation. When you lower that interest rate, what kind of impact is that going to put on housing prices, given that the demand has not gone down and it's only increasing?
Trying to think about the capital gains tax where you pull forward a bunch of transactions that would have happened in future years. And that movement of money, where someone turns an asset into cash, creates a big cash balance in a new person's bank account. That movement of money, is that not an inflationary pressure, even just a little bit?
If you could just answer the question, if the carbon tax were eliminated, would that make your job easier in terms of reducing?
Inflation would be lower.
But what I am worried about is those who want to desire to be wealthy. And I don't think that's a bad thing. In fact, I think that's a great thing. If, in fact, we undermine young Canadians' dreams to become wealthy, to become successful, do you not believe that that has the effect of undermining our productivity?
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
I am very pleased to be here this morning with Senior Deputy Governor Carolyn Rogers to discuss our recent monetary policy report.
Governor, it's my understanding that each central bank sets its own interest rates. Is there a global interest rate that would impact a Canadian mortgage?
Global interest rates do impact Canadian interest rates. Global financial markets are very integrated. So in Canada, obviously, we're very integrated with the United States, so the interest rates in the United States have an impact on us. Because we have our own currency, because we have a flexible exchange rate, we can run our own monetary policy, so our interest rates in Canada don't need to be the same as the U.S. rate or global rates. But there is a limit to how far they can diverge. We're not close to that limit. We have the ability to run our own monetary policy geared to what Canadians need.
Okay, just on that vein, we see in the U.S. that the U.S. Fed has held the rate, and yesterday the Prime Minister said interest rates would come down. When you do cut the rate, whenever that does happen, what kind of impact does that have on the Canadian dollar if the U.S. market stays the same and the U.S. holds their rate?
Well, the Canadian rate is already below the U.S. rate. We're at 5. They're at 5.25 to 5.5, and it's hard. It's a little hard to say exactly what will happen on the day. It'll probably, on balance, weaken the Canadian dollar a little bit, but a lot of it depends on expectations. If you go back a few months, the expectation in the market was that the Fed might cut before the Bank of Canada. That expectation has shifted. To some extent, that's already built into the markets. So, yes, I think if we move lower than the Fed, that will tend to depreciate the Canadian dollar. That's partly how monetary policy works. A weaker dollar stimulates our exports, so monetary policy becomes less restrictive.
The Prime Minister said, like I said yesterday, that interest rates would come down. He was sure of that. But his housing agency is also saying, CMHC, that housing starts last year, this year, next year will all decline. In fact, CMHC is saying that we need 5 million more homes on top of whatever is being built. And the National Bank said Canadian households should not expect any significant relief from housing cost inflation. Now, when you lower that interest rate, what kind of impact is that going to put on housing prices, given that the demand has not gone down and it's only increasing?
Well, the housing market is very sensitive to interest rates, and right now the policy rate at 5% is restraining demand. It is making, obviously, the cost of a mortgage higher, restraining demand. If we lower interest rates, it will be less restrictive on housing, and other things equal, housing will tend to be stronger than it otherwise would have been. In our own forecast, we do have a pretty strong pickup in housing over the course of this year. We also have some increase in housing prices. We also expect that supply, while it isn't going to be able to grow quickly, we do expect supply will be growing gradually, and so the gap will be narrowing. But I would agree, it's definitely going to take some time to close that supply shortage.
Yeah, respectfully, Governor, I don't think you fully answered that. We're going to see a supply, we already have a supply shortage in housing, we see a rise in demand, correct?
Yes, we have a supply shortage, no doubt.
And according to CMHC, housing affordability will not meet what Canadians expect today. According to what you just said, would you have a timeline on, given everything that all the numbers you have today, what kind of timeline are Canadians looking at for housing affordability to come back to what it used to be in Canada?
Well, look, I think housing prices have gone up a lot through the pandemic. They went up 50% in 2 years through the pandemic. They came down about 15%. They're back up somewhat now, so they're net down about 10%. We're not really in the real estate business, but our own forecast is that housing prices will continue to move up gradually. So I don't think you're going to see a big change.
Is there a fear of a cut increasing demand further? That might also push up the shelter inflation?
That is a risk. We do highlight that in our report. I think
is that more of a possibility than not, given housing starts are decreasing?
Well, in our forecast, as I said, we've built in a fairly strong growth in housing activity through this year, and we've built in some increase in prices. So we've taken that risk on board in our base case projection. It could be even stronger than we expected, and that is a risk that we've highlighted.
When you were here about 6 months ago, we talked about fiscal and monetary policy, and I believe you said that if the rate of growth in government spending could be at or below 2%, we'd be good. But spending growth next year for the federal government is 6.7%. So I'm not as steeped in economics, and I always learn something from you every time that you're here. I'm trying to understand how that is not inflationary pressure.
Okay, so let me back up a little bit. So first of all, when we're looking at, so that 2% number I gave you is real government spending on goods and services. It's not nominal spending. It's not public account spending. It's the national accounts measure of government spending on goods and services. So those numbers aren't directly comparable. What I can say in terms of our projection, so why if government spending, if governments are not increasing their deficits and government spending is growing around 2%, potential output, the economy is growing about 2%, so government spending is not adding more to demand than supply is growing. So it's roughly
okay. I'm going to jump in right there if that's okay. So expanding the deficits is expansionary fiscal policy, correct?
Correct.
In the last year and a half, the government has added net, not gross, net new spending of $100 billion to the fiscal framework. That's all deficit financed. Is your testimony that we are no longer in an expansionary fiscal environment?
My testimony is that the fiscal situation, this budget relative to the fall economic statement, the deficit to GDP, the debt to GDP track has not changed significantly. So I don't expect it's going to have a significant macro impact relative to our previous forecast. So in other words, I don't think the federal budget is going to have a big impact on the forecast that we published
Okay,
a few weeks
so
ago.
would you say now that fiscal and monetary policy are rowing in the same direction?
I would say, I mean, overall, coming back to our forecast, the impact, so in most of the provinces tabled their budgets ahead of the NPR. They did increase spending, and it was largely deficit financed. That has increased the contribution to growth from government. So last time I was here, I think I said government spending on goods and services this year was forecast to grow at about 2.25%. That has now moved up to 2.75%. That is somewhat above 2%. So yeah, that is not helpful in trying to get inflation down. It is built into our forecast. We still get inflation back to the 2% target. It does get there gradually. The final thing I'll say is there are a number of risks to our forecast, and we highlight those in the back. I mean, to the extent that the federal government sticks to its fiscal guardrails, the risk on government spending is managed. I mean, we see some bigger risk to our inflation forecast coming from geopolitical events. Others have mentioned the housing market. We think those are bigger risks.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. I know you mentioned before that we could take a calculator and do it ourselves, but I'd certainly appreciate the bank's model or how it's looking at government spending, because you can understand how it's a little bit confusing. But I'll move on to my last question.
And we can talk to you offline about that.
That's very helpful.
Honest,
but I just have one more question, Governor.
Quite complicated.
All tax increases are not the same with respect to inflation. So I'm trying to think about the capital gains tax, where you pull forward a bunch of transactions that would have happened in future years. And that movement of money, where someone turns an asset into cash, creates a big cash balance in a new person's bank account. That movement of money, is that not an inflationary pressure, even just a little bit?
Well, as I said, we're going to have to go through the budget a little more carefully. There are also, on the spending side, there are a number of new spending initiatives, as you've highlighted. Those will have different types of fiscal multipliers. So, for example, military spending that is mostly buying importing, say, U.S. machinery is not going to have much inflationary impact in Canada.
I'm out of time, but I will look forward to your capital gains.
I'm getting to capital gains. I mean, I think so all to say, we need to look at the various measures more carefully, and we will do that getting to July. My analysis at this point is very macro. There's more spending going into the economy. The government's tax measures are pulling more money out of the economy. So from a macro perspective, the net effect isn't that big from an inflationary point of view.
It's pulling money out, but money that wasn't going to be brought out anyway because the assets weren't going to be sold. Anyway, that's a bit academic, but maybe we could talk about that offline.
Let me ask you a pretty straightforward question. If inflation today was 2.1, 2.2, instead of 2.8, 2.9, would that make your job easier in terms of a decision to reduce the policy rate?
If we thought it was going to be sustained at that level, absolutely yes.
Yeah. Okay, and just earlier in this meeting, you testified that the incremental increase in the carbon tax from $65 to $80 represented 0.1% of inflation, and that if it hadn't happened, inflation would be 2.8. Correct?
Correct.
And when you were here in October, you testified that the overall effect of the carbon tax at $65 a ton was 0.6% of inflation. Is that correct?
Correct.
So the combined effect, to be absolutely clear, today is that at $80 a ton, the carbon tax contributes roughly 0.75% to inflation, correct?
That's not quite accurate. It's to the rate. What matters for inflation is the increase in the carbon tax. So that's the 0.1 to 0.15. Yet you are correct that if the carbon tax was eliminated, yes, there would be a drop in the price level of about 0.7. So for 1 year, inflation would be 0.7 percentage points lower.
On that talking point about 1 year, I just want to correct that as well. It's 1 year in perpetuity. You can only eliminate the carbon tax once.
Right.
So my question to you is fairly simple. If the carbon tax were repealed, which is what Conservatives will do when we are in office, and it were repealed in April, would that have been helpful in your decision to reduce interest rates and as a result, help millions of mortgage holders in Canada reduce their payments?
Well, as I said before, if you as you just said, if you eliminate the carbon tax, you can only do that once. So it'll drop inflation for 1 year by our estimate about 0.7. A year later, inflation will go back up 0.7 because the once-off decline in the price level will fall out of the rate of change calculation. So in terms of monetary policy, I mean, we've had tax changes like this in the past. I mentioned the cut in cigarette taxes in 1994. Changes in GST have a similar one-year effect. Those are things we tend to look through. In fact, one of the measures of core we typically follow is something called CPI ex food, energy, and taxes for exactly that reason, because we want to see what we're focused on is the underlying trend in inflation. I mean, this conversation is a little hypothetical,
I've just got limited time. If you could just answer the question, if the carbon tax were eliminated, would that make your job easier in terms of reducing?
Inflation would be lower for 1 year, but it would not be sustainably lower, so I don't believe it would have a big impact.
Yeah, okay. And I want to circle back to this issue of the delta between, and I realize you said we have flexible monetary policy in Canada, but there is a limit, which you said yourself.
Yep.
How big can the delta be? We already have a weak dollar at 72 cents. It's way too low. I just had a meeting, for example, with the Canada Food Grains Bank in Winnipeg last week. All their contracts are in US dollars. They feed the poor in countries all over the world. So this has real life impacts on people. Life or death impacts the Canadian dollar. That's just one example. So how far are you willing to go to jeopardize the value of the Canadian dollar?
Look, our flexible exchange rate works well. It's what allows us to run a monetary policy that is geared to Canadians. I'm not going to draw a line in the sand. Clearly, if we cut interest rates and that weakens the Canadian dollar, that is something you take into account with how much you need to reduce interest rates to get the same amount of monetary policy stimulus. So it is certainly something we're going to take into account. But
10 seconds.
The whole reason you have a flexible exchange rate in our own currency is so that we can gear monetary policy to the needs of Canadians, and that's what we intend to use that system to the benefit of Canadians.
Thanks. Who sets the interest rate for Canada?
The Governing Council of the Bank of Canada.
Right, and you're supposed to do that independently.
Yes.
Okay. At the end of question period, Prime Minister Trudeau yesterday said, and I quote, that and interest rates will be coming down, I'm sure, in the coming months. Have you communicated to the government that you'll be reducing interest rates?
Look, I have regular conversations with the Minister of Finance, but no, I don't. We take our decisions when we take our decisions, and I communicate that decision to the Minister of Finance after we've taken the decision.
So there's no way that the Prime Minister could know that interest rates are coming down?
We haven't taken the decision yet, so.
So there's no way that he would know that interest rates are coming down. Why would he say that?
I think you should ask the Prime Minister that question.
I think we will. I think it's exactly what we're going to ask that. Don't you think that's an irresponsible comment of him to make?
I think you should take this up with the Prime Minister. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. I want to talk, I'm going to switch gears and just talk briefly about, with Ms. Rogers, if that's okay, about productivity. I agree with you in your speech on March 26th, of which you said this is a breaking glass moment. I want to talk about one particular factor. I know that there are many. You talked about it a little bit in Canada, and you talked a little bit about it in your speech. When you talked about capital investment and the lack of capital investment. Canada is, of course, predicted to be dead last in the OECD. And so we need capital. We need capital to maintain and increasing and to improve our productivity, to grow our economy, and to fight inflation. Is now the time to increase taxes on capital?
Well, as MP Davies pointed out, we have seen declining capital investment over a long period of time and over multiple different tax regimes. We're not tax experts, so we're not going to evaluate any one particular measure. What I would say is there's really three things that go into productivity. There's labor, there's capital intensity, and then there's basically a multiplier in terms of how effectively we use those other two things. Our productivity problem spans across those things. Capital intensity, capital investment is one of those things, but we have room to improve in all three areas.
Yeah, it makes sense, so presumably, and some of the issue, I think, is competition, otherwise why that investment is not being used by businesses, and I think Mr. Davies makes that point well. But if, in fact, we reduce the amount of pie, we take more money from the private sector and give it to the public sector, if, in fact, Canadian businesses have less investment, less capital, we're going to be less productive. That's basic economics.
Is that a question?
Yes. Or you can get a statement. You can disagree or agree. Sorry, go ahead.
At a basic, so at a basic economic level, that's true. As I said, there's three things that go into productivity. And we have room to improve on all three things. I talked about all three of them in the speech. The other investment's one area.
Another issue in your excellent speech, Ms. Rogers, you talked about was the difference in sort of cultural or societal, sort of that entrepreneurial spirit that experts have commented that the Americans seem to have more than Canadians. One of the things that I'm very challenged by this NDP Liberal government is their demonization of entrepreneurs and of success and of business owners. If, in fact, you hear things like business owners are cheats, if in fact you hear more and more this sort of class warfare, eat the rich type of commentary from the NDP Liberal government, I'm not worried so much about those who are already prosperous, but what I am worried about is those who want to desire to be wealthy. And I don't think that's a bad thing. In fact, I think that's a great thing. If in fact we undermine young Canadians' dreams to become wealthy, to become successful, do you not believe that that has the effect of undermining our productivity?
I think Canada has a lot of entrepreneurial spirit. We have a strong education system. We have a lot of the factors that should set us up well to improve our productivity. I'll leave it at that.